Culiacan, Sinaloa. November 3, 2019. At 9:12 a.m., a local radio host named Miguel Herrera went live on air at Radio Corazon. For 3 years, his program had followed the same structure every morning. Traditional regional music, short transitions, no commentary that could be interpreted as political or confrontational. In a city shaped by organized crime, survival depended on anonymity. Radio Corazon was not influential, it was tolerated. That distinction mattered. That morning, a caller identifying himself as Antonio Vasquez was put through live. Station logs confirmed the call was not screened. What followed lasted exactly 37 seconds. During the broadcast, Vasquez openly mocked the sons of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. He claimed they no longer controlled key territory in Sinaloa. He laughed while speaking, referring to a rival figure known only as El Lobo, and suggested that ownership of the region was about to be violently reasserted. Miguel Herrera did not interrupt. He did not cut the feed. In later statements, he said the delay was hesitation, not agreement. He believed the call was bluster, a provocation that would pass unnoticed. By sunset, that assumption was proven fatal. Antonio Vasquez's body was discovered hanging from the station's transmission tower, visible from the road. His tongue had been removed. A handwritten message was pinned to his chest using a metal wire. The wolf forgot who owns the forest. Within 48 hours, 12 additional bodies were discovered across Culiacan and its surrounding municipalities. The locations were spread deliberately. Markets, side streets, abandoned vehicles, none were hidden. Each victim was connected to the broadcast. Some had communicated with Vasquez previously. Others had ties to logistics, transportation, or enforcement factions associated with the same power struggle. In multiple cases, investigators found mobile phones still playing the recorded call. Battery depletion reports suggest the audio had been looping for hours. Several victims showed signs of restraint and prolonged exposure to sound before death. Authorities quickly dismissed the possibility of random retaliation. The killings followed a consistent pattern. Time intervals were nearly identical. The placement of bodies suggested deliberate choreography. Messages were consistent in phrasing and symbolism. This was not reactive violence. It was organized messaging. Miguel Herrera shut down Radio Corazon the same night. Officers responding to the station later documented blood inside the broadcast booth. It was found near the microphone stand and control panel. The source was never conclusively identified. Herrera attempted to clean the equipment himself before investigators sealed the building. Phone records show Herrera received more than 60 calls in the first 6 hours after Vasquez's body was discovered. Journalists, local officials, unknown numbers traced to prepaid devices. He disconnected the station line after the 15th call. According to police notes, the silence that followed appeared to distress him more than the calls. What investigators initially withheld from the public was Herrera's professional history. Before taking over Radio Corazon, he had spent nearly 20 years working alongside U.S. federal agencies, including the DEA. His role involved mapping cartel communications, logistics corridors, and operational hierarchies across Sinaloa. He understood how cartels communicated indirectly. He understood symbolism. That background allowed Herrera to recognize something critical. This was not revenge, it was not punishment, it was demonstration. Detective Rosa Morales was assigned to the case the same evening. By then, the confirmed death toll had reached 12. Crime scene photographs showed repeated references to the broadcast, radio frequencies written on cardboard, playing cards marked with timestamps, portable radios placed near bodies, all tuned to Radio Corazon. In several locations, investigators recovered notebooks containing handwritten transcripts of the call. Morales concluded the violence had been staged to permanently bind the broadcast to the deaths. The perpetrators could have silenced Vasquez privately. Instead, they amplified his voice and used it as an execution tool. Herrera reviewed the evidence personally. He noted symmetry in body placement, consistency in mutilation, controlled restraint. This was cartel punishment refined into performance. Investigators now believe the operation required long-term preparation. Someone had monitored Herrera's routine. Someone knew exactly when he would hesitate. Someone understood his psychological profile well enough to exploit it. The broadcast was not the trigger, it was the signal. When the body count reached 15, authorities acknowledged the violence exceeded internal cartel conflict. Internal memos described it as a psychological operation designed to assert dominance through public fear. The objective was clear: transform a civilian broadcaster into an unwilling amplifier. Herrera had not been speaking to his audience. He had been speaking to someone who had been listening for years. Radio Corazon never returned to air. No individual has been formally charged with orchestrating the killings. Miguel Herrera has not given another public interview. What remains is a 37-second recording that transformed a forgotten radio show into one of the most chilling cartel messages in modern Mexican history. The hunt did not begin that day. That day only revealed who the prey was. The silence after Rosa left felt like a living thing, pressing against Miguel's eardrums until they ached. He sat motionless in his chair for what felt like hours, watching dust motes dance in the amber light filtering through his office window. The blood on his equipment had dried to a rust-brown crust that flaked when he touched it, leaving crimson fragments under his fingernails like accusations. Miguel Herrera had built this life carefully, deliberately, a quiet existence measured in vinyl records and morning coffee, in the ritual of queuing up forgotten corridos that spoke of simpler times when heroes and villains wore their roles like uniforms. 3 years ago, when he'd walked away from the DEA with Danny Ochoa's blood still under his fingernails and the taste of betrayal coating his tongue, he'd thought he was burying the past. Now it felt like the past had been patiently digging its way back to the surface, waiting for the perfect moment to drag him down. His fingers traced the scar along his ribs, where a Sicario's bullet had carved a permanent reminder of his last official operation. The wound had healed, but some nights he still woke feeling Danny's hand slipping from his as the warehouse exploded around them. Some nights he could still hear his partner's last words. "They knew we were coming, Miguel. Someone told them." The radio station had been his penance and his sanctuary, a place where he could disappear into other people's stories, where the only violence was sung about in 3-chord progressions and metaphors. Radio Corazon, he'd named it, Radio Heart, as if naming it something pure could wash the blood from his hands. Miguel stood slowly, his knees protesting the sudden movement. At 58, he felt every year of chasing shadows through desert safe houses and mountain laboratories. His reflection in the darkened window showed a man aged beyond his years, silver threading through black hair, lines carved deep around brown eyes that had seen too much. He'd been handsome once, before the work hollowed out something essential inside him. The framed photograph on his desk caught the dying light. Elena, frozen at 35, her smile still radiant enough to make his chest ache. Cancer had taken her 2 years into his DEA career, and he'd thrown himself into the hunt afterward with the desperate fury of a man trying to outrun grief. 20 years of that fury, 20 years of telling himself that justice was worth the cost, until the warehouse in Badiraguato proved him catastrophically wrong. His phone buzzed, a text message from Carmen, his station manager and the closest thing to family he had left. "Saw the news. Are you safe? Coming in early tomorrow." Carmen Delgado was 63, with steel-gray hair and the protective instincts of a mother bear. She'd hired him despite his reputation, despite knowing exactly who Miguel Herrera used to be. "Everyone deserves a second chance at peace," she'd told him on his first day, pressing a cup of her legendary Café de Olla into his hands. "Even legendary ghost hunters." He typed back, "Don't come in tomorrow. Take the day off." Her response was immediate, like hell. "You need watching after, viejo." Miguel almost smiled despite everything. Carmen was one of 3 people in Culiacán who could get away with calling him an old man. The other 2 were Father Sebastian at the church, where Miguel sometimes confessed sins he couldn't name, and Dr. Raúl Ibarra, who'd patched him up after more close calls than either man cared to count. These were his anchors now, quiet people living quiet lives, unaware that loving Miguel Herrera might have just painted targets on their backs. The thought made his hands shake as he reached for the bottle of mezcal he kept hidden behind his first edition Vicente Fernandez albums. The liquid burned going down, but it was a clean burn, nothing like the toxic fire of guilt and rage that had consumed him for 3 years. Outside, Culiacán was settling into its uneasy nighttime rhythm. Honest people barricading themselves behind locked doors while predators emerged to claim the shadows. This was a city where children learned to recognize the sound of different gunfire before they could read, where mothers crossed themselves when police cars passed. Miguel had chosen this place because it was familiar territory, because he understood its particular brand of danger. But familiarity was proving to be a liability. Someone knew his patterns, his weaknesses, his carefully constructed defenses. Someone had been studying him with the patience of a scientist, waiting for the perfect moment to activate him like a weapon. The mezcal bottle was half empty when Miguel finally admitted the truth that had been clawing at his chest since Rosa showed him those crime scene photos. This wasn't random. This was personal. Someone from his past had reached across 3 years of careful silence to remind him that men like Miguel Herrera never really got to walk away. He thought of Carmen's laugh, of Father Sebastian's gentle absolution, of the simple pleasure he'd found in spinning records for insomniacs and night shift workers. All of it felt fragile now, precious in the way things became when you realized they could be taken away. Outside his window, the city held its breath, and Miguel understood with growing certainty that tomorrow would bring fresh horrors. The ghost hunting him had been patient for 3 years. It wouldn't wait much longer. Miguel's eyes had just begun to close when the envelope slid under his office door like a pale serpent across the dusty floor. The sound was barely perceptible, a whisper of paper against wood, but in the predatory silence that had settled over Radio Corazon, it might as well have been a gunshot. He froze, mezcal glass halfway to his lips, watching the cream-colored rectangle rest innocuously against the baseboard. No footsteps in the hallway, no creak of floorboards. Whoever had delivered it moved with the ghost-quiet efficiency of a professional, someone who understood that sound could mean death in a place like this. Miguel set down his glass with deliberate care, his hand moving instinctively toward the .38 beneath his desk. 3 years of civilian life hadn't dulled the reflexes that had kept him alive through 2 decades of hunting monsters. His fingers closed around familiar steel as he approached the envelope, every sense hyper-alert for the telltale sounds of an ambush. The paper was expensive, heavy stock with a watermark he couldn't make out in the dim light. His name was written across the front in elegant script, the kind of penmanship they'd stopped teaching in schools decades ago. No return address, no postmark, hand-delivered with the casual confidence of someone who could walk through his defenses like they were made of smoke. Miguel's hands trembled as he tore open the envelope. Inside was a single photograph and a folded letter, both yellowed with age. The photo hit him like a physical blow. Danny Ochoa, alive and grinning, standing next to Miguel outside the DEA field office in Mazatlan. They looked impossibly young, impossibly confident, their arms slung around each other's shoulders like brothers. He remembered the day it was taken, 3 weeks before the Badiraguato operation, 3 weeks before everything went to hell. The letter was written on the same expensive paper, dated 3 years ago, the exact date of Danny's death. Miguel's vision blurred as he read the familiar handwriting he'd seen in countless case files and evidence reports. Miguel, if you're reading this, then I'm already dead, and the bastards finally got me. I've been carrying this insurance policy for months, hoping I'd never need it, but the walls are closing in fast. There's a leak in the task force, hermano. Someone's been feeding information to the Guzman organization for over a year. I know who it is. The night we're supposed to hit the warehouse, they're going to try to kill us both. I've hidden copies of everything. Bank records, communication intercepts, photographs that prove the connection. You'll find them in the place where we used to count stars and plan our futures. Trust no one in the agency. They're all either bought or scared. When this is over, when you've survived what I probably won't, you need to disappear. Let them think you're broken. Let them think you've given up. But remember this. The man who killed me is still out there, still wearing a badge, still collecting his blood money. And the Guzman boy, the smart one, not the crazy ones, he's got a memory like a steel trap and patience like a spider. He won't forget that we got close enough to hurt his family. Watch yourself, Miguel. This war isn't over. It's just changing battlefields. Your brother always, Danny. P.S. The radio station is perfect, hiding in plain sight while you figure out who to trust. But be careful who you let get close. In this business, love is just another weapon they can use against you. Miguel's legs gave out. He collapsed into his chair, the letter fluttering to the floor like a dying bird. Danny had known about the betrayal, known about the ambush, known he was going to die, and somehow, impossibly, he'd reached across 3 years of death and silence to deliver a warning just when Miguel needed it most. The photograph stared up at him from the desk. 2 dead men pretending they had futures, Danny's eyes bright with the kind of idealism that got good men killed. Miguel touched his partner's face with one finger, remembering the weight of his body, the way his blood had felt sticky and warm in the desert heat. His phone rang, shrill and sudden in the heavy silence. Miguel stared at it, paralyzed. 4 rings. 5. On the 6th, muscle memory took over, and he answered without looking at the display. Radio Corazon. Silence. Then, soft as a prayer, "Did you get my gift, Miguel?" The voice was cultured, educated, with the faint accent of someone who'd spent time in American schools. Young, but not naive. Dangerous in the way that only true intelligence could be. "Who is this?" Miguel's voice came out as a croak. "Someone who's been waiting 3 years to have this conversation. Someone who understands that justice delayed isn't always justice denied." A pause, long enough for Miguel's blood to turn to ice water. "My name is Ivan. My friends call me El Chapito, but you can call me the son of the man you spent 20 years trying to destroy." The line went dead, and Miguel understood with crystalline clarity that his 3 years of hiding were over. The ghost had found him, and it wore the face of El Chapo's heir. The phone slipped from Miguel's nerveless fingers, clattering against the desk before tumbling to the floor. The dial tone droned like a funeral dirge in the suffocating silence of his office. He stared at the device as if it were a venomous snake, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. This isn't real. The thought hammered against his skull with desperate insistence. This is shock. Trauma. A breakdown. But the letter still lay scattered across his desk, Danny's handwriting as clear and damning as it had been 3 years ago. The photograph still showed 2 men who'd believed they could change the world, 1 bullet at a time. And somewhere in the shadows of Culiacan, El Chapo's son was orchestrating a symphony of revenge with Miguel as his unwitting conductor. Miguel's hands shook as he reached for the mezcal bottle, finding it empty. The glass fell from his grip, shattering against the floor in a spray of crystal that caught the amber light like scattered tears. He didn't flinch at the sound. Couldn't flinch. Every nerve in his body felt wrapped in cotton, insulated from everything except the growing certainty that his careful, quiet life was disintegrating around him. Hide. The instinct was primal, overwhelming. Run. Disappear. Find a hole so deep they'll never dig you out. He was already reaching for his go-bag, the one he'd kept packed for 3 years, hidden behind a false panel in his office closet, when his phone rang again. This time he checked the display. Carmen. His finger hovered over the decline button. Carmen was safety, normalcy, the kind of uncomplicated human connection he'd thought he could still have. But safety was an illusion now, and everyone who cared about Miguel Herrera had just become a target. The ringing stopped, started again immediately. "Shit." Miguel answered on the 4th ring, trying to inject some semblance of normalcy into his voice. "Carmen, I told you." "Miguel?" Her voice was wrong, thin, strained, barely controlled. "Miguel, there are men outside my house." The world tilted sideways. Miguel gripped the desk edge until his knuckles went white. "What men?" "Black SUVs. They've been there for an hour, just sitting. My neighbor, Mrs. Restrepo, called to warn me." Carmen's breathing was rapid, panicked. "They're not police. Police don't sit that still." Miguel closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of other people's lives settling on his shoulders. 20 years of running operations, of calculating acceptable losses, and he'd never learned how to math his way out of caring about innocent people. "Carmen, listen to me very carefully. Do you have somewhere safe you can go? Family out of the city? My sister in Guadalajara, but Miguel? Go, now. Don't pack anything they'd notice missing, just go." His voice cracked slightly. "And Carmen, don't come back to the station. Don't call me. For the next few weeks, pretend you never knew Miguel Herrera." The silence stretched long enough that he thought she'd hung up. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of understanding. "This is about those murders, isn't it? About what happened this morning." Miguel wanted to lie, to tell her it was just paranoia, just the ramblings of a burned-out ex-agent who jumped at shadows. But Carmen had earned honesty, even if it might get them both killed. Yes. How bad? Worse than you can imagine. Miguel stared at the crime scene photos Rosa had left behind, at bodies arranged like pieces on a chessboard. These people, they don't just kill Carmen, they make art out of it. He heard her sharp intake of breath, followed by the sound of movement, drawers opening and closing. The radio station? Probably gone, maybe forever. The words tasted like ashes. I'm sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry. Save the apologies for when we're both still alive to hear them. Carmen's voice had steadied, hardened into the tone of someone making life or death decisions. Miguel? Whatever you did before, whoever these people are, you were good at your job, weren't you? At hunting them? Miguel thought of Danny's blood soaking into desert sand, of warehouses that exploded when you got too close to the truth, of 20 years spent learning how monsters thought. I was the best. Then remember how to be that man again, because I don't think they're planning to let you stay retired. The line went dead, and Miguel sat alone in the gathering darkness of his office. Outside, Culiacan hummed with its usual nocturnal energy, music drifting from cantinas, the distant pop of fireworks or gunshots, the eternal dance of predator and prey that defined border cities. But something had changed in the rhythm. The city felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the next movement in a composition Miguel was only beginning to understand. Somewhere in those shadows, a ghost was watching, measuring his reactions, preparing the next move in a game that had been 3 years in the planning. Miguel picked up the photograph of Danny, studying his partner's face for answers that would never come. Then he opened his desk drawer and pulled out the .38 special he'd hoped never to use again. The hunt was about to begin, and this time, Miguel wasn't sure who was the predator. The weight of the .38 in Miguel's hands felt like holding his own damnation. 3 years of pretending he could be someone else, someone clean, and all it took was one phone call to strip away the fiction. His fingers traced the gun's familiar contours, the slight nick in the grip from a firefight in Tijuana, the smooth trigger worn by 1,000 hours at the range, the weight that had once meant salvation and now felt like a millstone. Danny's letter lay spread across his desk like evidence of his own failure. Trust no one in the agency. How many times had Miguel replayed that final operation, wondering who had sold them out? How many faces had he studied in the months afterward, searching for tells, for guilt, for some sign of betrayal? The mole could be anyone. Rosa, with her careful questions, Director Vega, with his 2 convenient reassignments, even Deputy Director Morales, who'd pushed so hard for Miguel's early retirement. Let them think you're broken, Danny had written. Christ, it hadn't been acting. The warehouse explosion had shattered something fundamental inside Miguel, left him hollow and bleeding in ways that had nothing to do with shrapnel wounds. He'd stumbled through the debriefings like a ghost, answering questions in monotone, while part of his soul screamed into the desert night. But what if Danny was wrong? What if the leak hadn't come from inside the agency at all? Miguel's blood turned to ice as the pieces began sliding together with sickening clarity. Ivan Guzman, El Chapito, brilliant, patient, the son who'd inherited his father's cunning without the theatrical brutality. Young enough to plan in decades, smart enough to turn Miguel's own past into a weapon. The radio show this morning hadn't been random. El Lobo's call, the specific insults about El Chapo's family, the way he'd goaded Miguel into keeping the line open longer than protocol demanded, it had all been choreographed. Miguel was the instrument, the unwitting DJ spinning the soundtrack to someone else's revenge fantasy. And if Ivan had been planning this for 3 years, if he'd been watching and learning and positioning his pieces, Miguel's stomach lurched as a new horror presented itself. What if the leak in the DEA task force hadn't been about money or fear? What if it had been about love? He pulled out his laptop with shaking fingers, accessing files he'd hoped never to open again. Personnel records, mission reports, financial disclosures, the digital archaeology of his former life. The VPN connection crawled through layers of encryption, each security checkpoint a reminder of how deeply buried these secrets were supposed to be. There, Eduardo Sandoval, financial analyst assigned to their task force 6 months before the Badiraguato operation. Clean record, exemplary service, recently divorced with a young daughter in private school. Miguel remembered him vaguely, quiet, competent, the kind of background player who made operations run smoothly without drawing attention. The financial records painted a different picture. Eduardo's ex-wife, Marina Sandoval, had started dating a new man 8 months before the warehouse explosion. Carlos Mendoza, import-export businessman, with suspiciously clean finances and business trips that coincided perfectly with known cartel movement patterns. Eduardo's daughter had suddenly started attending one of Guadalajara's most expensive private schools, tuition paid in cash. Miguel's hands trembled as he dug deeper. Marina's new boyfriend had a younger brother named Joaquin Mendoza, currently serving a reduced sentence in a minimum security facility after providing valuable intelligence to federal prosecutors. Intelligence that had helped dismantle 2 rival cartel cells while leaving certain Guzman operations mysteriously untouched. They knew we were coming. Danny's dying words echoed in Miguel's head as the pattern became clear. Eduardo hadn't sold them out for money. He'd been manipulated, blackmailed, his daughter's safety leveraged against information about DEA operations. And when the warehouse exploded, when Danny died screaming Miguel's name, Eduardo had probably told himself it was the price of keeping his family safe. The laptop screen blurred as Miguel's vision went red around the edges. 20 years of chasing monsters, and he'd never learned the most important lesson. The cartel's greatest weapon wasn't violence, it was patience. They could wait decades for the right pressure point, the right moment of weakness, the right person to break. His secure phone buzzed with a text from an unlisted number. "Check your email, Miguel. Time to see how deep this really goes." Miguel's personal account showed one new message, sent from an address that was just a string of numbers and letters. The subject line read, "The Eduardo Sandoval Memorial Scholarship Fund." The email contained a single attachment, a video file time-stamped 3 years ago, the night before the Badiraguato operation. Miguel's finger hesitated over the download button. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. He clicked play and watched his world finish crumbling. The video showed Eduardo Sandoval in what looked like a hotel room, tears streaming down his face as he spoke into a cell phone. The audio was crystal clear. "They have my daughter, Miguel. They have Sofia. They say if I don't tell them about tomorrow's operation, they'll send her back to me one piece at a time." The terrible beauty of it hit Miguel like a physical blow. Ivan hadn't just orchestrated Danny's death. He'd documented it, kept the evidence like a trophy, waiting 3 years for the perfect moment to show Miguel exactly how thoroughly he'd been outplayed. The video kept rolling, and Miguel recognized the voice responding to Eduardo's confession, calm and reassuring and absolutely damning, his own. Miguel's own voice drifted from the laptop speakers like a ghost from another life. "Eduardo, listen to me. We can't abort the operation now. Too many moving parts, too many people depending on this intel. But I promise you, we'll get Sofia back. The moment we secure the warehouse, every resource goes to finding your daughter." The video continued, showing Eduardo's face crumpling with desperate relief. Miguel remembered this conversation now. The frantic call that had come in at 2 a.m., Eduardo barely coherent with panic. What Miguel had seen as a father's breakdown, Ivan had orchestrated as the final stroke in a masterpiece of manipulation. "You trust me, don't you, Eduardo?" His recorded voice continued. "Have I ever let you down? We go in tomorrow as planned. By sunset, Sofia will be home safe." Miguel slammed the laptop shut, but the damage was done. The truth sat in his chest like a tumor, growing and metastasizing until it consumed everything. Eduardo Sandoval hadn't betrayed them. Miguel had. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but with the kind of bone-deep arrogance that made good men dead men in this business. He'd known Eduardo was compromised, had seen the signs, heard the desperation, felt the wrongness of the situation like a chill in the desert air. But instead of calling off the operation, instead of protecting his people, Miguel Herrera, the DEA's golden boy, the man who always got his target, had pushed forward anyway. "Because you thought you were smarter than them," a voice whispered in his head. "Because you thought your 20 years of experience trumped their generational patience. Because you couldn't bear the thought of El Chapo's organization winning again." The photographs scattered across his desk seemed to mock him now. Miguel and Danny, arms around each other like brothers, both of them believing their cause was righteous and their methods sound. Heroes in their own story, too blind to see they were pawns in someone else's game. Danny had died because Miguel chose the mission over his team. And Eduardo Sandoval, God, what had happened to Eduardo afterward? The man had sacrificed his integrity, destroyed his soul trying to save his daughter, and Miguel had led him straight into the trap anyway. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Ivan. Guilt is a beautiful thing, isn't it? So clean, so pure. Unlike revenge, which gets messy. Miguel's finger hovered over the reply button, then stopped. Every response was another move in Ivan's game, another chance for the cartel prince to tighten the noose. But the silence felt like cowardice, and Miguel had spent 3 years drowning in his own weakness. He typed, "What do you want?" The response came instantly. "I want you to understand. My father built an empire, and your kind spent decades trying to tear it down. You took my brothers, my cousins, my friends. You made war on my family and called it justice." Another message, "But you were always so focused on the violence, you missed the real lesson. This isn't about drugs or money or territory. It's about legacy, about teaching the next generation of DEA heroes what happens when you forget that your enemies have children too." Miguel stared at the screen, feeling the weight of 20 years pressing down on his shoulders. How many sons had he created like Ivan? How many children had grown up planning revenge while Miguel collected commendations and slept the sleep of the righteous? His phone rang. Miguel answered without thinking. "Do you know what the beautiful thing about using you was?" Ivan's voice was soft, contemplative. "You did all the work for me. Every arrest, every raid, every small victory you celebrated. You were just clearing the field of my father's competitors, making room for something new to grow." "Eduardo's daughter," Miguel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What happened to her?" Ivan laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Sofia Sandoval graduated summa cum laude from Stanford last year. She's studying medicine now, wants to help people. A beautiful irony, don't you think? The daughter lives because the father died, and both happened because Miguel Herrera needed to be a hero." The phone line crackled with static. Or maybe it was the sound of Miguel's world continuing to collapse. "You want to know the most beautiful part?" Ivan continued. "Eduardo survived the warehouse explosion. Did you know that? Spent 18 months in a coma, another year in rehabilitation, and every day he was awake, he asked the same question. Where is Agent Herrera? I need to explain why I had to betray him." Miguel's vision blurred. "You're lying." "I never lie about the important things. Eduardo Sandoval died 6 months ago in a car accident outside Guadalajara. His last words were your name." Ivan's voice carried the satisfaction of a chess master announcing checkmate. "He carried that guilt for 3 years, Miguel. Just like you're going to carry this truth for whatever time you have left." The line went dead, and Miguel understood with crystalline clarity that Ivan Guzman's greatest weapon wasn't patience after all. It was the truth. Miguel sat in the darkness of his office, the dead phone still pressed against his ear like he could somehow call back the words, unmake the truth that had just shattered what remained of his world. Eduardo Sandoval had lived, had carried the weight of that betrayal for 3 years, asking for Miguel every day, wanting to explain, to apologize, to make sense of the impossible choice between his daughter and his conscience. And Miguel had never known, had never even asked. The 38 felt heavier now, less like salvation, and more like the inevitable conclusion to a story that had been written 3 years ago in a warehouse full of blood and fire. Miguel could see it all now. The careful choreography, the patience, the way Ivan had turned him into the architect of his own damnation. Every move Miguel had made since retiring had been anticipated, calculated, used. But there was something else in the silence. Something that felt wrong in the rhythm of Ivan's revelations. The cartel prince was meticulous, surgical in his psychological warfare. But there had been something almost desperate in that final statement about Eduardo's last words, a rawness that didn't fit the careful cruelty of everything else. Miguel pulled out Danny's letter again, his partner's handwriting swimming before his eyes. "Trust no one in the agency." But what if Danny hadn't meant there was a mole at all? What if he'd discovered something else entirely? That the leak wasn't coming from inside the DEA, but from the outside, from someone who had access to information that should have been impossible to obtain? His laptop buzzed with an incoming video call. The caller ID showed a name Miguel hadn't seen in 3 years: Elena Vasquez, senior intelligence analyst, currently stationed in Mexico City. Elena, who had processed their intelligence reports. Elena, who had access to operational details that never made it into official files. Elena, who had dated Danny for 6 months before transferring out of Culiacan. Miguel stared at the screen. Elena calling now, tonight, after 3 years of silence, couldn't be coincidence. Nothing was coincidence anymore. He accepted the call. Elena's face filled the screen. Older, tired, the laugh lines around her eyes now carved deeper by worry. Behind her, Miguel could see the sparse furnishings of what looked like a safe house, institutional beige walls and blackout curtains. Miguel. Her voice carried the weight of sleepless nights. I've been trying to reach you for hours. The phones are compromised. The official channels are being monitored. But this line should be clean for a few more minutes. Elena, what? Danny didn't die because of a leak, Miguel. He died because he figured out that there never was supposed to be anyone in that warehouse. Elena's words came in a rush, urgent and desperate. The intelligence that led you there, I processed it myself. It was too clean, too perfect. Real intelligence is messy, contradictory. This was a story someone wanted us to believe. Miguel felt his chest tighten. What are you saying? I'm saying the warehouse was empty because it was bait. The explosion wasn't meant to destroy evidence. It was meant to destroy you. Both of you. Elena leaned closer to the camera, her face stark in the blue light. I started digging after Danny died, following financial trails, communication patterns. Miguel, the intelligence that led you to Badiraguato came through channels that traced back to a shell company owned by Joaquin Mendoza. The name hit Miguel like a physical blow. Eduardo's ex-wife's boyfriend's brother, the man currently serving reduced time for cooperating with federal prosecutors. The web of connections was too intricate to be anything but deliberately constructed. Eduardo Sandoval was never the leak, Elena continued. He was another victim. They fed him real information about a threat to his daughter, but the daughter was never actually in danger. While he was panicking, confessing to you, begging for help, they were using his access codes to plant the fake intelligence that would send you into that trap. Miguel's hands trembled as the full scope of it became clear. They played us all. Worse than that, they made us play ourselves. Elena's voice cracked slightly. Miguel, I need to tell you something about Danny. Something he discovered the night before he died. The video feed stuttered, Elena's image freezing for a moment before resolving into pixelated fragments. When her voice returned, it was distant, distorted by digital interference. The person who orchestrated all of this, it wasn't Ivan Guzman acting alone. He had help from someone inside the highest levels of... The screen went black. No error message, no dropped connection warning, just sudden, absolute darkness. Miguel frantically tried to reconnect, but the application showed no record of the call ever having occurred. His office door exploded inward. 3 men in tactical gear moved through the doorway like shadows given form, weapons raised but not yet firing, professional, efficient, the kind of operators who killed for governments and cartels with equal precision. The man in front pulled off his mask, revealing a face Miguel recognized from intelligence photos. Joaquin Mendoza, supposedly serving time in a minimum security facility, supposedly cooperating with federal prosecutors, supposedly reformed. Agent Miguel Herrera, Joaquin said, his voice carrying the flat affect of a man accustomed to violence. You have something that belongs to my employers. Miguel's hand moved toward the .38, but stopped when he saw the red laser dots dancing across his chest. The radio broadcast this morning was just the opening act, Joaquin continued. Now comes the finale. The red laser dots held steady on Miguel's chest. 3 perfect circles of death that meant the difference between breathing and bleeding out on his office floor. But something in Joaquin's voice, too rehearsed, too careful, told Miguel this wasn't an execution. Not yet. You know what's beautiful about the truth, Agent Herrera? Joaquin stepped closer, his weapon lowered but ready. It's the only thing that can't be killed. Miguel's eyes flicked between the three operators, calculating angles and distances his body couldn't possibly cover fast enough. Elena was right, wasn't she? You've been running this from the beginning. Elena Vasquez was half right. Joaquin's smile was cold mathematics. Even Guzman thinks he's been orchestrating his father's revenge, but he's been dancing to music someone else composed. The real question is whether you're smart enough to figure out who's been conducting this orchestra. The laptop behind Miguel buzzed with an incoming message. Joaquin nodded toward it. Go ahead, read it, but keep your hands where I can see them. Miguel turned slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. The message was from Eduardo Sandoval's email account. Impossible, since Eduardo was supposed to be 3 years dead. The subject line read, "The truth about Danny's last discovery." You're going to want to open that, Joaquin said, unless you prefer living with questions that will eat you alive. Miguel clicked the attachment with trembling fingers. A document opened, an internal DEA memorandum dated the day before the Badiraguato operation. The header showed it was classified at the highest levels, accessible to perhaps a dozen people in the entire agency. But what made Miguel's blood freeze was the signature at the bottom. Deputy Director Catherine Morrison, the woman who had personally recruited him, who had built her career on bringing down the Sinaloa cartel, who had eulogized Danny as a hero and encouraged Miguel's early retirement. The memo detailed a joint operation between DEA and an unnamed cooperating cartel faction to eliminate competing organizations through strategic intelligence sharing. The Badiraguato warehouse had been deliberately leaked to the Guzman organization as a test of their new partnership's viability. Danny and Miguel were listed as acceptable losses in service of the larger objective. Morrison. Miguel's voice came out as barely a whisper. Deputy Director Morrison needed the Guzman organization to trust their new federal partners, Joaquin explained. What better way than to sacrifice 2 of their most effective agents? It proved the DEA was serious about collaboration. The office walls seemed to close in around Miguel as 20 years of service revealed itself as an elaborate lie. Every arrest, every raid, every moment of pride in serving justice, all of it orchestrated by a woman who saw him as nothing more than a chess piece to be sacrificed. But here's where it gets interesting, Joaquin continued. Ivan Guzman figured it out 6 months ago. That's when he approached us with his own proposal. Use Morrison's network against her, make her pay for betraying her own agents by watching her greatest success, Miguel Herrera's destruction, become her greatest failure. Miguel turned back to face his captors, understanding flooding through him like ice water. You're not here to kill me. We're here to offer you a choice. Joaquin gestured toward the laptop. You can stay here, hiding behind your microphone and your guilt, while Morrison continues to use good agents as currency in her private war. Or you can help us finish what Danny started when he discovered the truth. Elena? Safe. For now. Morrison's people found the safe house 20 minutes after your call ended, but Elena Vasquez didn't survive 3 years investigating this conspiracy without learning how to disappear. Joaquin's expression softened slightly. She's the one who contacted Ivan. She's the one who suggested using you as the catalyst to bring Morrison down. Miguel's hand drifted toward the .38 again, but this time not for protection. The weight of it felt different now, not like an ending, but like a choice between 2 kinds of justice, the official kind that had gotten Danny killed, or the street kind that might actually balance the scales. What do you want me to do? Joaquin smiled, and for the first time it reached his eyes. Tomorrow morning, you're going to make another broadcast, but this time, instead of being someone else's unwitting instrument, you were going to tell Culiacan exactly who killed their loved ones and why. Morrison's network, her partnerships, her body count, all of it. And then we see how Deputy Director Catherine Morrison likes being the one whose life becomes a public spectacle. Joaquin stepped back, his men lowering their weapons. The only question is whether you have the courage to honor your partner's sacrifice by finishing what he died trying to expose. Miguel looked down at Danny's letter, at the words that had haunted him for 3 years. Trust no one in the agency. But maybe Danny hadn't meant trust no one. Maybe he'd meant trust the truth, wherever it led, even if it led to war. Resolution. The morning sun cast long shadows across Culiacan as Miguel adjusted the microphone one final time. His hands were steady now, steadier than they'd been in 3 years. The weight of Danny's letter sat folded in his shirt pocket, close to his heart where it belonged. Buenos dias, Culiacan. This is Miguel Herrera, and today I'm going to tell you a story about truth. The broadcast lasted 47 minutes. Miguel spoke without notes, without hesitation, his voice carrying across the city like a cleansing wind. He told them about Deputy Director Catherine Morrison's shadow network, about agents sacrificed for political convenience, about the real reason bodies had been appearing with radio references, not cartel revenge, but a desperate attempt to expose corruption that reached the highest levels of power. By the time he signed off, Miguel's phone was ringing with calls from journalists, federal prosecutors, and Elena Vasquez, who had surfaced from hiding to corroborate every detail. The arrests began within hours. Morrison was taken into custody at her Quantico office, her carefully constructed empire crumbling under the weight of evidence that Elena and Danny had gathered over months of secret investigation. The network of corrupt agents, the shell companies, the body count, all of it exposed to sunlight for the first time. Miguel watched the news coverage from his office, feeling something he hadn't experienced since Danny's funeral: peace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of purpose fulfilled. 6 months later, the small cemetery outside Culiacan was quiet in the late afternoon, the kind of peaceful that only comes after storms have passed. Miguel knelt beside Danny's grave, placing fresh flowers next to the weathered headstone. "We got her, partner," he whispered to the marble. "Elena testified yesterday. Morrison's looking at life without parole." The radio station continued to operate, but differently now. Miguel played the old corridos, yes, but he also told stories, real stories about real people trying to find dignity in an undignified world. The ratings were modest, but the letters he received told him it mattered. Elena had taken a position with the Justice Department's anti-corruption task force, using her skills to hunt the hunters who had betrayed their oaths. They spoke weekly, sharing intelligence and something that might eventually become friendship rebuilt from the ashes of their shared grief. Even Ivan Guzman had kept his word. After Morrison's arrest, the violence in Culiacan had subsided to its baseline level of manageable chaos. The cartel prince had apparently found more interesting targets than a aging disc jockey who played música ranchera and told uncomfortable truths. Miguel stood slowly, his knees protesting the years and the weight they'd carried. As he walked back toward his truck, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Some debts can only be paid with truth. Thank you for paying yours. Jay." Miguel looked out across the valley where he'd spent most of his adult life, first hunting monsters and now trying to understand them. The mountains were the same, the sky was the same, but something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer running from the past or toward an impossible redemption. He was simply present, in this moment, in this place, carrying forward the memory of a good man who had died trying to do the right thing. The drive back to town took him past the radio station, its small tower reaching toward the evening sky. Miguel pulled into the parking lot and sat for a moment, listening to his replacement, a young woman named Sophia who played contemporary music and spoke about hope in a voice that reminded him why he'd started broadcasting in the first place. His phone rang. Elena's name appeared on the screen. "Miguel? I wanted you to know, Eduardo Sandoval's daughter just graduated medical school. She sent me a letter. She wants to work with communities affected by violence, help people heal." Elena's voice carried a smile. She said her father would have been proud that his sacrifice meant something. Miguel closed his eyes, feeling the last piece of his burden settle into something he could carry. He would have been. "You okay?" "Yeah," Miguel said, and meant it. "I think I finally am." After Elena hung up, Miguel sat in the gathering dusk, watching the lights of Culiacan flicker to life below. Tomorrow there would be another broadcast, another opportunity to tell the truth as he understood it. Tonight, for the first time in 3 years, he would sleep without dreams of fire and betrayal. The truth had set them all free, not from consequences, but from the weight of secrets that had bent their souls toward breaking. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything Danny would have wanted.